My 4-year-old nephew slapped me across the face and said, "Mommy says you deserve it because you're a brokey." My mom revealed my darkest secret to make everyone laugh. I revealed hers to make everyone leave. My mom, Gina, always thought she was the funniest person in every room. She'd been doing stand-up comedy at open mics for years, never getting past 5-minute sets at dive bars, but she called herself a professional comedian. Her whole personality was making people laugh, even if it meant throwing anyone under the bus for a punchline. Growing up, every embarrassing thing I did became material for her act. When I wet the bed at 7, she told it at my birthday party like it was hilarious. When I got my first period and bled through my pants at school, she made it her closing bit for months. But the worst thing she ever did happened at my engagement party. I'd been with my fiancé Luke for 4 years, and we finally decided to get married. The engagement party was at Luke's parents' country club with all his family, his dad's business partners, and everyone important in his life. Gina showed up already drunk, wearing this sequined dress like she was accepting an award. She kept interrupting conversations to tell jokes that weren't landing. People smiled politely but were obviously uncomfortable. Halfway through dinner, Gina clinked her glass for a speech nobody asked her to give. She started talking about how proud she was that I'd found someone willing to marry me despite everything. Then she said she had a funny story about why she never thought this day would come. She told everyone about when I was 19 and had a mental breakdown. Not just mentioned it, but performed it like a comedy routine. She mimicked me crying, acted out me begging her to help me, did an impression of me saying I wanted to die. She told them about finding me with pills, rushing me to the hospital, the 72-hour hold. She made sound effects of the heart monitor. She actually got on the floor to show how I'd collapsed. People weren't laughing. Luke's mom had tears in her eyes. His father looked sick. My future brother-in-law walked out. But Gina kept going, saying the funniest part was when I told the psychiatrist I felt worthless. And he said, "Well, at least you're self-aware." She laughed at her own joke while 200 people sat in horrified silence. Luke didn't know any of this. I'd been planning to tell him eventually, but not like this. Not as entertainment for his entire family. His grandmother was clutching her pearls. His business partners were exchanging looks. Gina finally noticed nobody was laughing and said tough crowd before sitting down like she'd killed it. Luke's family left immediately. Half of them haven't spoken to me since. They think I'm unstable or that it runs in the family after seeing Gina. Luke almost called off the engagement. It took months of couples therapy for him to trust that I was okay, that it was a one-time crisis years ago. Gina never apologized. Said I was too sensitive and comedy comes from truth. She actually used the engagement party story in her next set, talking about how rich people have no sense of humor. She told me I should be grateful she made me memorable. The wedding was in 3 months. Gina assumed she'd be giving a speech, already working on material. She kept asking for embarrassing stories about Luke to make it balanced. She bought a white sequined dress that looked like a wedding gown, said she needed to stand out in photos. I told her she wasn't giving a speech. She laughed and said I couldn't stop the mother of the bride from talking. That's when I decided Gina needed to learn what it felt like. The week before the wedding, I invited all her comedy friends to what she thought was my bachelorette party. She was thrilled I was including her scene. Brought 15 people from her open mic nights, all wannabe comedians who thought they were funnier than they were. I said I wanted to do a roast, but with a twist. We'd roast our parents for all the crazy things they did raising us. Gina loved it. Said finally I was developing a sense of humor. She went first, telling more stories about my childhood that made me sound pathetic. Other people told actually funny stories about their parents. Then it was my turn. I started with how my mom got pregnant with me at 17 by her married English teacher, Mr. Randolph. How she blackmailed him for money until his wife found out and he killed himself. How Gina kept the suicide note that mentioned her by name. The comedian stopped laughing. I continued about how Gina gave me vodka in my bottle to make me sleep through her parties. How she brought men home who would comment on how I was developing. How she told me to be nicer to them because they paid our rent. How she stole my college fund from my grandmother's inheritance and spent it on comedy classes she failed. I told them about her getting fired from 12 jobs for stealing. About her going to rehab 4 times but leaving when they wouldn't let her perform at group therapy. About her showing up to my high school drunk and the principal calling child services. About her telling the social worker I was lying for attention. The room was dead quiet. Gina tried to laugh it off, but I kept going. I told them about the time she showed up at my 8th grade talent show so drunk she fell off her chair, and how the other parents had to help her to the parking lot while I pretended I didn't know her. I described finding her passed out in our bathtub with a lit cigarette that burned a hole in the shower curtain. I mentioned the Christmas she sold my Nintendo for drug money and told me Santa wasn't real anymore because we were too poor. Ted stood up first, not looking at either of us, and walked toward the door without saying anything. Lucy stared at Gina with her mouth slightly open, the same way people look at car accidents they can't stop watching. Kira held her phone up the whole time, recording everything, and I could see the red light that meant it was still going. The vindication felt like electricity in my chest, hot and bright and powerful, but underneath it something cold was spreading through my stomach. I'd just destroyed my mother in front of everyone she knew, everyone who made up her whole social life, and the look on her face made me feel like I'd kicked a dog. She tried to laugh, that fake comedian laugh she used when jokes bombed, but her voice cracked halfway through and came out like a cough. Her face had gone white under her makeup, and I could see a vein pulsing in her neck. Gina opened her mouth and the word liar came out, but it sounded weak and desperate instead of angry. She said I was making things up for attention, that I always exaggerated everything, but her hands were shaking so hard she had to put down her drink. The other comedians were looking at each other, having silent conversations with their eyes, and I knew they were remembering all the times Gina had told stories about me. Greg cleared his throat and suggested we all take a break, maybe get some air. His voice too loud in the quiet room. People started moving toward the door in this awkward shuffle, not talking, just the sound of chairs scraping and feet on the floor. Within 2 minutes, the room emptied until it was just me and Gina sitting across from each other at a table covered in empty glasses and wadded-up napkins. She looked at me with an expression I'd never seen on her face before, something that looked like actual fear instead of her usual confidence. She asked why I would do this to her, and her voice was small and old. I told her she did this to herself when she turned my suicide attempt into a comedy routine at my engagement party, in front of 200 people. The words came out flat and hard, and I watched her face crumple like paper. She started crying, but not the dramatic way she usually cried when she wanted something. This was different, uglier, with her makeup running in black streaks down her cheeks. She said I'd ruined her reputation in the comedy community, that these people were her only friends, that I'd taken away the one thing that made her feel like she mattered. I stood up while she was still talking and grabbed my jacket off the back of the chair. She kept saying my name, asking me to wait, to let her explain, but I walked out and left her sitting there alone. The hallway outside the private room felt too bright and too quiet, and I could still hear her crying through the door. I didn't feel as good about what I'd done as I thought I would. I just felt tired and mean, and like I'd swallowed something sharp. Luke called me 3 times that night, but I let it go to voicemail because I didn't know how to explain what I'd just done. I sat on my couch staring at my phone lighting up with his name, feeling my stomach twist tighter each time. When I finally listened to the messages the next morning, his voice sounded worried and confused, asking if I was okay and saying Gina had called him crying about me attacking her in public. The third message said his mom was asking questions and he didn't know what to tell her. I felt rage flood back into my chest because of course Gina had already called him. Of course she was spinning this to make herself the victim, just like she always did with everything. She'd probably told him I was cruel and unstable, that I'd humiliated her for no reason, that she was just trying to be a good mother. I threw my phone across the room and it hit the wall hard enough to leave a mark in the paint. I met Luke for coffee the next afternoon at the place near his office, arriving early and ordering something I didn't drink. He came in looking tired, with dark circles under his eyes like he hadn't slept much. We sat down at a corner table and I told him everything that happened at the fake bachelorette party before Gina could twist it any further. I described inviting her comedy friends, setting up the roast, waiting for my turn, and then laying out every horrible thing she'd ever done. Luke listened without interrupting, his coffee getting cold in front of him, his face getting more serious with each detail. When I finished, he was quiet for a long time, just looking at me with an expression I couldn't read. Then he asked if I felt better now that I'd hurt her back, and the question hit me like a slap. I opened my mouth to say yes, but nothing came out because the truth was I didn't feel better at all. I felt sick, and angry and scared that I was turning into her, that I was becoming someone who hurts people and calls it justice. Luke said his parents were asking if we should postpone the wedding because they were worried about what kind of family drama would happen at the ceremony. Panic rose in my chest so fast it made my hands shake, because I'd spent months planning this wedding, picking out flowers and trying different cakes and arguing with the venue about table arrangements. I didn't want Gina to ruin this too, to take away another important day by making it all about her dysfunction. He told me his mother specifically said she couldn't handle another public spectacle like the engagement party, that she was still getting questions from relatives about what they'd witnessed. His dad thought maybe we should wait until things settled down, until my family situation was more stable. The word stable made me want to scream because my family had never been stable, would never be stable, and if we waited for that, we'd never get married at all. Gina showed up at my apartment 2 days later without calling first, and when I looked through the peephole, I almost didn't open the door. She looked genuinely broken in a way I'd never seen, her hair unwashed and pulled back, wearing sweatpants and an old t-shirt instead of her usual attention-grabbing outfits. I opened the door and she walked in without asking, sitting down on my couch like her legs couldn't hold her up anymore. She told me that 2 comedy clubs had uninvited her from their open mics after word spread about what I'd revealed. The Laugh Factory told her they were going in a different direction, and the Comedy Store said they were full for the next 6 months. I felt a flicker of guilt before I remembered her on the floor at my engagement party, acting out me collapsing, making sound effects of the heart monitor while Luke's grandmother clutched her pearls, and his business partners exchanged horrified looks. She admitted that the story about Mr. Randolph was true, that she'd gotten pregnant by her married English teacher when she was 17, and blackmailed him for money until his wife found the letters. She said she'd carried guilt about his death for 27 years, that she still had nightmares about his wife calling her a murderer at the funeral. She was 17 and stupid and didn't understand that blackmail could make someone desperate enough to kill themselves, She told me his suicide note mentioned her by name, said she'd ruined his life and his marriage, and she'd kept it hidden in a box under her bed all these years. I sat there shocked because Gina never admitted to anything, never took responsibility, never showed real remorse that wasn't just manipulation to get what she wanted. I didn't know if this was real honesty or just another performance, another way to make herself the victim of her own choices. Luke's parents invited both of us to dinner at their house to clear the air before the wedding, and I knew this was some kind of test. Gina promised she'd behave and apologize properly, that she understood how serious this was, but I didn't trust her to get through one meal without making everything about her somehow. Luke told me this dinner was important to his family, that his mother was really struggling with whether she could support our marriage given everything that had happened. I agreed to go because I didn't have a choice, but I spent the whole drive over feeling like I was going to throw up. Gina met me there, arriving in her beat-up car and wearing a plain black dress that looked like she was going to a funeral. We walked up to the house together without talking, and I could feel her shaking next to me. The dinner started awkward and got worse from there, with Luke's mother being coldly polite in that way rich people are when they hate you but have manners. His father barely spoke, just passed dishes and cut his food with precise movements that felt angry. Gina launched into an apology that started okay, but somehow turned into excuses about her difficult childhood and struggling as a single mother and never having any support. Luke's mother let her talk for maybe 2 minutes before cutting her off mid-sentence, saying that many people have hard lives without exploiting their children's trauma for attention and entertainment. The words hung in the air like smoke, and Gina's face went red and then white. Luke's father set down his fork and said he wanted to know if Gina planned to use his son's wedding as material too, if she'd already started working on jokes about their family. Requested Reds is on Spotify now. Check out link in the description or comments. The question was so direct and brutal that even I felt defensive of Gina for a second, before remembering that he was right to ask. Gina's mouth opened and closed, but nothing came out at first, and I watched her chest rise and fall in quick, shallow movements, like she couldn't get enough air. She grabbed the edge of the table with both hands, her knuckles turning white, and when she finally spoke, her voice came out small and broken in a way I'd never heard before. She said yes, she'd been a terrible mother, that she knew it even when she was doing it, but she couldn't stop herself because making people laugh was the only time she felt like she mattered at all. Luke's father leaned back in his chair and asked if she planned to use his son's wedding as material too, if she was already writing jokes about this dinner in her head right now. The question sat there in the middle of the table like a knife, and everyone looked at Gina waiting for her answer. She shook her head and tears started running down her face, actual real tears without the dramatic sobbing she usually did for effect. She promised she wouldn't give a speech at the wedding or make any jokes about our family, that she understood she'd already done enough damage. Luke's mother set down her wine glass with a sharp click and said that wasn't enough, that Gina needed to understand she was on thin ice with their entire family, and one more incident would mean she'd never be welcome around them again. I felt something weird twist in my chest, almost like I wanted to defend Gina even though she deserved everything they were saying to her. The words came out before I could stop them, that she was still my mother and she'd be at the wedding, and everyone turned to look at me with surprise on their faces, including Luke. His mother's eyebrows went up and his father frowned, and I could tell they thought I was making a mistake, but I couldn't take the words back now. Luke drove me home after dinner without saying much, just the sound of the car engine and the radio playing something low that I couldn't focus on. We pulled into my apartment parking lot and he turned off the car but didn't move to get out, just sat there staring at the steering wheel. He asked me if I actually wanted Gina at the wedding or if I was just doing this because I felt like I had to. I opened my mouth to answer but realized I didn't know what to say because I'd spent so long being angry at her that I hadn't thought about what I actually wanted. He turned to look at me and said it was okay to uninvite her if that's what I needed to feel safe on our wedding day, that his family would understand and support whatever choice I made. I told him I needed time to think about it, and he nodded, kissed me on the forehead, and said he'd call me tomorrow. I went inside and lay on my couch staring at the ceiling for hours, playing the dinner over and over in my head and trying to figure out what I felt underneath all the anger. 2 days passed where I barely left my apartment, just ordered food and sat with my phone in my hand staring at Gina's contact information. I thought about all the times she'd humiliated me, all the boundaries she'd crossed, all the ways she'd used my pain for her own benefit, but I also thought about what would happen at the wedding if she wasn't there, how everyone would ask where she was and why, how the whole day would become about her absence instead of about me and Luke starting our life together. I picked up my phone and called her before I could change my mind. She answered on the first ring like she'd been waiting, and I told her she could come to the wedding, but there would be strict boundaries. No speech, no jokes about me or our family, and if she drank too much, my cousin would escort her out without discussion. She agreed immediately without arguing or making excuses, and the fact that she didn't fight me on it actually worried me more than if she had. The wedding planner called me 3 days later while I was at work, and I could hear panic in her voice before she even explained why she was calling. She said Gina had contacted her directly asking about microphone access during the reception, wanting to know the technical setup and when would be the best time to use it. I felt rage flood through my body, so fast it made my hands shake, because Gina had literally promised me 2 days ago that she wouldn't give a speech. I left work early and drove straight to Gina's apartment, not even calling first because I knew if I gave her warning, she'd prepare some excuse. She opened the door in sweatpants with her hair a mess, and I pushed past her into the living room. When I confronted her about calling the wedding planner, she put her hands up and said she just wanted to sing a song for us, that it wasn't a speech, it was a musical tribute. I told her I knew she was lying and that she was planning some kind of performance that would make everything about her again. I stood in her messy living room with comedy notebooks scattered everywhere and told her that if she did anything at the wedding that drew attention to herself, I would never speak to her again. She started crying and saying I was being cruel, that she just wanted to celebrate her only daughter's wedding and I was treating her like a criminal. I didn't move or soften my voice, just stood there and told her that her celebrating had always meant humiliating me, and I wouldn't allow it this time. She sank down onto her couch and buried her face in her hands, and for a second I almost felt bad before remembering the engagement party and how she'd acted out my suicide attempt for laughs. I left without saying goodbye and drove to Luke's apartment to tell him what happened. Luke listened to everything and then suggested we hire security for the wedding specifically to manage Gina, and even though it sounded ridiculous, I knew it was necessary. His parents called him while I was there, and when he explained the situation, they offered to pay for security because they didn't trust Gina either after everything that had happened. I agreed because I realized I needed to protect my wedding day, even if it meant treating my own mother like a threat to my happiness. We spent the rest of the evening looking at security companies and explaining the situation, and I felt both relieved and deeply sad that this was what my life had come to. 3 days before the wedding, I got a message on social media from Ted, one of Gina's comedy friends who'd been at the fake bachelorette party. He said he wanted to talk to me about something important, and could we meet for coffee? I almost ignored it, but something in the message made me curious, so I agreed to meet him at a place near my apartment. He showed up looking uncomfortable and guilty, stirring his coffee for a full minute before finally telling me that Gina had been calling all her comedy friends trying to get them to come to the wedding and support her. He said it seemed like she was planning something and he thought I should know, that he felt bad for not speaking up about her behavior before. I thanked him and left the coffee shop feeling my stomach drop, because I knew Gina was going to try something no matter how many boundaries I set. I drove straight to Gina's apartment again and didn't even wait for her to invite me in before I started confronting her about inviting her comedy friends to my wedding. She broke down completely this time. Not the fake crying she usually did, but real ugly sobbing that made her whole body shake. She admitted she couldn't handle being alone at an event where everyone judged her, that she knew she'd ruined our relationship, but she was still my mother, and she was terrified of being completely cut off from my life. I stood there watching her fall apart and felt uncomfortable because it was easier to hate her when she was just being awful, but this vulnerability made everything more complicated. She said she didn't know how to be at my wedding without her friends there as a buffer, that she was scared of facing Luke's family alone after everything she'd done. Luke and I had an emergency session with our therapist the next day, and I admitted I was scared of becoming like Gina, someone who hurts people and then justifies it. The therapist helped me see that recognizing this fear meant I was different from Gina, because Gina never questioned whether her actions were wrong or thought about how they affected other people. Luke reached over and took my hand, told me he loved me and trusted me, but he needed to know I wouldn't use his vulnerabilities against him the way Gina had used mine. I promised him I wouldn't, and meant it, but I also knew I'd already crossed a line by exposing Gina's secrets at the fake bachelorette party, and I had to figure out how to be better than that. We left the session with a plan for the wedding and boundaries for Gina, but I still felt uneasy about everything that could go wrong. I spent the night before the wedding sitting at my kitchen table with a blank piece of paper in front of me. Luke was at his parents' house for some pre-wedding tradition his family did, so I had the apartment to myself. I picked up the pen and put it down 3 times before I finally started writing. The letter came out messy and honest in a way I couldn't manage face-to-face with Gina. I told her she could come to the wedding and bring one person from her comedy friends, someone who would help keep her grounded instead of encouraging her to perform. I wrote that our relationship was broken and I didn't know if it could be fixed, but I was willing to try if she could respect real boundaries this time. I explained that I needed space to build my marriage without constantly worrying about being turned into material for her next set. The last paragraph was the hardest because I had to admit that some part of me still wanted a mother, even if Gina could never be the kind I needed. I sealed the envelope and left it on the counter, planning to drop it at her apartment in the morning. I barely slept that night, kept seeing her face at the fake bachelorette party when I exposed all her secrets. I wondered if I'd gone too far, or if she'd finally understand what it felt like to be humiliated in front of people you cared about. The morning of the wedding, I was standing in my bathroom trying to fix my makeup when someone knocked on my apartment door. Luke wasn't supposed to pick me up for another 2 hours, and the wedding planner had my schedule down to the minute. I opened the door and found Gina standing there with my letter in her hand, her eyes red but not in her usual dramatic way. She looked smaller somehow, like she'd been deflated. She asked if she could come in, and I almost said no, but I stepped aside and let her walk past me into the living room. She sat on my couch and held up the letter, her hands shaking slightly. She told me she'd read it 4 times and she understood what I was saying, that she'd spent her whole life using comedy to avoid dealing with real feelings. Her voice cracked when she said she was going to start actual therapy, Not the kind where she performed for the therapist or turned her sessions into bits. She said she didn't expect me to forgive her or trust her, but she wanted to try to be better, even if it was too late for us to have a normal mother-daughter relationship. I stood there by the door not knowing what to say because this was the first time Gina had ever apologized without making excuses or turning it into a joke. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand and said she was proud of me for setting boundaries, that she wished someone had taught her how to do that when she was young. I told her she needed to leave so I could finish getting ready, and she nodded and walked to the door. Before she left, she turned and said she'd be sitting quietly in the third row with Lucy, who'd agreed to be her support person for the day. The wedding ceremony happened at a garden venue Luke's parents had picked out, with white chairs set up in rows facing an arch covered in flowers. I stood in the bridal suite with my bridesmaids while the coordinator gave everyone their cues, my stomach doing flips every time I thought about Gina sitting out there in the audience. Luke's mother had barely spoken to me during the rehearsal dinner, and his father kept giving me these worried looks like he expected chaos to break out at any moment. The music started, and I walked down the aisle focusing on Luke's face instead of looking at the guests. Gina sat in the third row exactly where she said she'd be, wearing a simple blue dress instead of the white sequined thing she'd bought months ago. Lucy sat next to her with her hand on Gina's arm, and Gina's face was wet with tears, but she stayed completely still and quiet. The ceremony was beautiful in a way I hadn't let myself hope for, with Luke saying his vows and me saying mine without any interruptions or performances. At the reception, I watched Gina from across the room as she approached Luke's parents at their table. I couldn't hear what she was saying, but I saw her talking without any of her usual animated gestures or attempts at humor. Luke's mother's face stayed cold and tight, but she nodded when Gina finished and said something brief in response. Luke's father shook Gina's hand in a formal way that made it clear they weren't suddenly friends, but at least they were being civil. I felt something loosen in my chest. Not forgiveness exactly, but maybe the beginning of being able to breathe without constantly waiting for the next disaster. 6 weeks after the wedding, Gina and I started meeting for coffee every Thursday morning at a place halfway between our apartments. The first few meetings were awkward and stilted, with both of us being too careful about what we said. I'd made a list of topics that were off limits, things she couldn't ask about or turn into comedy material, and she actually followed the rules without complaining. She told me about her therapy sessions in a real way, not performing or exaggerating for effect, just talking about what she was learning about herself. She admitted her therapist had pointed out that she'd used comedy as a weapon to keep people at a distance, that if she made them laugh or shocked them first, she didn't have to risk real connection. I listened and didn't offer forgiveness or reassurance, just let her talk and process without making it about me. She asked about the wedding, and I told her the parts that felt safe to share, and she didn't interrupt or make jokes. Our relationship would never be normal or easy. The damage was too deep and went back too far. But I was learning that protecting myself didn't mean I had to completely destroy her, that I could have boundaries without needing revenge. Luke and I were building our life together in our new apartment, making plans for the future without the constant fear hanging over everything. I still flinched sometimes when my phone rang and I saw Gina's name, still worried she'd slip back into her old patterns. But for now, having coffee once a week with clear rules felt manageable, and that was enough. I was finally free from waking up every day wondering when I'd become her next punchline, and that freedom was worth more than any apology she could give me. All right, that's the story. I'm really glad you stuck around because this stuff feels better when it's shared. Hope you leave this one feeling a little lighter.